Hey everyone, Pratik here. Laura and I thought it would be a great idea to show you what it would look like if we went through and recorded the retouching process that me and her typically go through. And the purpose of this is a couple of reasons. Number one, it's great to see some of the results as well as the techniques that we use for the retouching process. And number two, what is it that me and Laura talk about during the retouching process? For example, even if it's with myself or other retouchers, what is the communication that we go through when we're doing a full retouch on an image? So here we have this image that Laura sent over, and also we have this document here with a few notes that she addresses mentally and writes them down on a copy of an image. This is really useful because aside from just seeing the before file, typically retouchers, they do a good job with skin, but if there's anything else on top of that that you really want them to fix, make sure that you're sending over at least an image, a JPEG, or a PSD file with a set of notes, just like Laura has done here. There's many ways to do this, but the main point here is that you have to be sure you're communicating your vision and exactly what you want fixed. That way, there's no room for error, you get exactly what you're looking for, and that's pretty much it. So let's get started. Now with this image, for those of you who are familiar with my retouching series, I have actions that I normally have set up here that I go through and have everything just ready to go. But we're going to go through everything by scratch, just because even if you don't have the actions, you can follow along and see exactly how I do each of these steps, okay? First step is I'm going to add a folder here on the right hand side where the layers are. I'm going to name the group and call it our cleaning stage. And in our cleaning stage, we usually have our dodge and burn, healing, clone, and some of the other options. But actually, you know what? I would say the cleaning stage is specifically for healing and cloning, so we're going to keep it to just that for now. I'm going to actually also right click and see if I can make the layers here a little bit bigger. So I'll put medium thumbnail so you can see a bit easier. Maybe large thumbnails. That looks pretty good to me. And in this one, I'm going to call it my healing. I'll do all my healing work. I'm going to use my healing brush. Going to keep it to current and below with my sample size. If you're using 2019 for Photoshop, make sure that use legacy is checked, and that is basically the healing brush that Photoshop has used before 2015 and below, and it makes the results a lot more accurate in my personal and professional opinion. Next, here on the left hand side, we have our brush size. The main thing that I want to be concerned about primarily is the hardness. Make sure the hardness is set to 0%. Keep everything else the same. Do not change the percentage of spacing. That should be left by default, which is 25%. Also, while we're at it over here where it says size, make sure that's turned to off. And that is basically to make sure that your pen pressure on your Wacom stylus, if you're using one, is not going to interfere with your brush size. And so we keep the brush size relatively accurate and relative to the actual brush size itself, and not related to how much pressure we're adding when we're actually retouching. So I have that set to off. Now I'm going to go ahead and actually do some of the most basic things first. And I think what we'll do here is I'm going to go ahead and go through some of these blemishes. I'm using a regular healing brush. And the way the healing brush works, for those of you who do not know, is I use Alt or Option, sample a good piece of skin, click with my Wacom stylus, and then go ahead and brush and remove any blemishes or imperfections that I want to take care of. The key principle, as always, is make sure that whenever you're healing something, always cover it entirely before going forward. Otherwise, you end up not healing things correctly and you get a blemish like this. See, you want to make sure that everything is covered before moving on. The next thing that I want to mention is that try not to zoom in too much, because we don't really need to be concerned with keeping things perfect at like 300% or 200%. Really, all we're focused on is this distance right here. I'll go ahead and revisit the notes that Laura sent over in a bit. However, I'm going to take care of the most obvious blemishes that I think need to be taken care of. She has really good skin, so I'm not too concerned with a lot of blemishes, because I don't think there are. Most of the retouching seems to be environmental cleanup and things that are not skin related. I think that looks pretty good for now. I'm going to leave everything as is. And also the good part about this is in case you have anything that you want to get rid of, you can easily do so later on with this workflow because it's non-destructive and you're not healing on a background layer or duplicate of the background layer. You're just healing on the actual blank layer itself. Makes sense? And I turn that on and off for now. You can see it's very gentle, some blemish on the chest and the arms. I'll also zoom in a little bit here and get rid of this block here. Okay, so really subtle for now. Let's take a look at the notes. And you can see some of the flyaways, so I think we'll go ahead and tackle that. We can either do this with a healing brush or clone brush, but I think healing brush should work for now. In case you get too close to the edge, let's say I get too close to the edge like this, and you get a little blurry mark, you don't have to worry. I'm just going to hit Command Z. Then switch over to my clone brush if you want to. And there you can actually clone out something closer to the edge. And that's kind of my principle in how I work. So I think that takes care of that part. Also, some of these notes are subjective in the sense that if there's anything that I think should also be removed, I'll go and tackle that and let her know that I did. That way, she can see if it's something that is relative to her interest, and if it's not, I can always bring it back. Okay, so another thing that I could do here is I'm going to command on my keyboard and click on the actual text, and then it locates the text itself. I can hit delete, and that's gone. The other thing that I can do right now is this little guy here. So I'll zoom out. I'll zoom in. I'm hitting Z on my keyboard to zoom in and out, and scrolling with my mouse or stylus by going left and right on my stylus. By pushing down on my tablet and going left and right, that zooms in for me. And then I switch back to my keyboard. Also on my retouching series, I have a ton of different things, like obviously like actions, but on top of that, I also have, I guess you could say, different techniques and beginner tools and tips in case you are completely new to Photoshop and you want to learn more about each of these individual tools. I highly recommend it, but we're not going to go into that in detail in this current tutorial because I want to just show you how we actually retouch this image from start to finish rather than focusing on the things that maybe most people might know. So just keep that in mind. I also see here it says pull in dress to make sure it fits the body better. There's a couple of ways that we could actually do that. We could liquefy this, and I think I might do that. I might liquefy that just so that we keep the ridge. Another thing that you can also do is I can use a blank layer. I can click on my clone brush, which you can do through keyboard shortcuts if you want to. And if you want to see what the keyboard shortcuts are for each tool, you simply need to click on these three dots here, go to Edit Toolbar, and scroll through, and the letter assigned next to each of these keys are your keyboard shortcut for that tool. You can also delete them if you want to make sure that only one tool has the shortcut that you have established. And that's just another side tip that I think is really interesting. But as I mentioned before, I think I'm going to actually experiment and see what it looks like if I clone out this edge here. Another benefit of having a Wacom tablet is always being able to have clean lines whenever you so choose to. And hit Command Z in case you go too far. I also like to rotate a lot. In this instance, I'm going to do that. The rotate function is R by default on your keyboard, or in case you change it to something else, then it is that key. But rotating is really nice because it gives you the opportunity to have better angles when you're working like this. And for me, I think this is really valuable because this angle is a lot easier when I rotate my keyboard or canvas. So I think that actually looks pretty good. Gonna name that my clone layer. And with my clone brush, I always have the sample size set to current and below as well. Okay, So that's the first part. I think that looks pretty good. And I'm going to go ahead and click and delete that one. This one, the notes that are actually written on here are actually written on the image itself, I believe. So I'm not going to be able to delete that layer, but if that ever does happen, I sometimes like to use a regular brush tool, pick up my flow to 100%, and then just scribble over those areas. It almost feels really good having to take away these notes, knowing that I took care of what I needed to do. And over here it also says pull and dress, but I'll keep that to liquefying. These two notes we'll do in the retouching process. Remove wrinkles, I could do that too, and remove stain. So let's focus on that one next. I'll go down back to my healing layer. Oops, Command Z, that was definitely not what I was meant to do. I'm gonna remove these stains here first, because that seems to be the easiest thing to do. Like so with my healing brush. Also the wrinkles, we could do that here too. Another really great tip is because the wrinkles themselves are also white, you can, if you want to, use a clone brush with a flow of about 10% and just go over them till they're gone. That's another option. You can use it to soften up wrinkles in case you can't get rid of anything perfectly. So we have many different options. I accidentally brushed that in the healing layer, but that's okay because honestly, both of them contain the same kind of pixels. They're not special. They're just labeled to make life easier. But you know, I'll be honest, a lot of times even I don't follow the naming structure. And I try my best to. Okay, so I'm doing the same thing here. I'm using my clone brush. I'm going to be gently just removing those little folds. The other thing that we can do is clone that out as well. I call this like clone painting because if you sample with a low flow, you're able to kind of paint away the imperfections by sampling parts of the image. And I use that technique a lot for many different situations and scenarios just because it makes it really easy for me to get rid of things quite quickly. I'll do the same thing on this side and that side. And I don't know how far she wants me to go with the wrinkles, but I think that looks pretty good. And if she has a problem with that, then I think she'll tell me afterwards. But I think for now that looks really good. It got rid of the wrinkles. Let's see here. Yep, that looks really good. I like it. And then we'll go on to the next one, which is going to be the stain. We did that. So I'll click that. I'll delete that. I'll click remove stain. I'll delete that. I'll go ahead and use my regular brush and just cover that up. That looks much better. Great. Here's another one. Here's another little tidbit here we can fix. And that's basically just referring to these odd edges that we see. So I'll just clone that out. All right, that looks pretty good. And let's see what else we have here. So we have a whole bunch of stuff on this side. It looks like just a bunch of cleaning out gradients and marks, so we can fix that really quickly. I'll go down to my healing layer here. And actually, you know what? Maybe not. Maybe we'll click on the clone brush, use a big soft brush, 10% flow, and I'm just going to sample and brush it out really nicely. Thing that looks really nice. And even if that doesn't work, you can use a regular paintbrush and brush as well. Okay, so we have a couple of things here. I'll take care of that. The dirty floors. I also have a course on backdrops and backgrounds in case people want to see how that looks like, because that in itself can be a whole different, I guess, chore in getting rid of, and there's multiple ways of doing it. Thankfully, we have a really solid backdrop, which is nice. In case you can't see backdrops really well, especially black ones, you can add a curve layer here in your adjustment layers. You can brighten that up. And so temporarily, you get a bright view of the background so you can see how well your work is or what else you have left to do. It's really, really cool tip because now you don't have to worry or be concerned at all, really. I want to show you another really good tip. So let's say you want to manually brush out some of these background imperfections, but what happens is sometimes when you start brushing, you get banding. And the reason why that happens is currently we are in 8-bit, meaning that we can actually go to 16-bit. So under image mode, I want to select 16 bits per channel. What that basically means is that there's going to be more information that we can use for each brushstroke that we do. And what I basically mean by that is if we were on 8 bits per channel and if we started brushing, you'd get a lot of banding because for every bit of information that we add, in this instance being the brushstroke, there's not enough steps in between the lightest and darkest points. And what that does is it creates banding. But when you have the document set to 16 bits per channel, what it means is that anything going forward, so say me adding a lot of brushstrokes, there'll be no banding because there's going to be a lot of steps of information or a lot of colors between the brightest point and the darkest point. And banding happens when there's too much of a gap between one point to another. In this instance being brushing from a really dark area like this to a bright area like this. So I like 16-bit for that reason. And even if it's not in 16-bit at the moment, everything that we do from here on out will have a lot of smoothness applied to it as we begin brushing. The one thing to make sure of is I'm going to add a new layer here. I'm going to call this background cleaning. And I'm going to have my brush selected. But before that, let's actually go to our eyedropper tool. And I want to make sure the sample size says about 5 by 5 and the sample says current and below again. Because I do not want to sample this curve layer. I want to sample everything underneath it. Otherwise, you end up brushing with a bright color rather than the actual color of the background. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my brush tool here. I'm going to have my flow set to about 5%, which is how fast the paint is going to come out. And now as I brush, it will end up becoming a lot smoother with the results. And as I keep sampling, it'll just sample the color that I should be sampling. So you can see here as I zoom in, the brushstroke itself is really, really smooth and gradual. You see what I mean? There's not much banding or weird areas happening or just blockiness of colors. It's just really nice and smooth. And that's what I mean by being in 16-bit. If I was in 8-bit and tried to do this, you'd see a bunch of steps or little circles happening because there's not enough colors being sampled or being layered. And that results in a lot of banding. So even if I zoom out and you see banding here, that's just because the way Photoshop works, and when you're zoomed out, it doesn't interpolate this correctly. But the correct view is when you're at 66.7% to 100%, you see that there's actually nothing there. Okay, so keep that in mind. Another thing that I actually like to do is, you can see here that the paper texture has a little bit of texture in it, but the paint itself doesn't. So I'm going to add some texture. I'm going to go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise. I'm going to add a 1% uniform and monochromatic. And that just makes it black and white, a nice even kind of uniform texture and a black and white texture rather than color. Because without monochromatic, it adds color noise. Okay, so there you go. So I quickly replaced the floor just by painting it out. I think that looks really good. And another fun tip, I can continue doing this for the rest of this background here. So say the background isn't exactly perfect and she wants me to clean out the gradient, I can add another layer. I can say background cleaning 2 and continue doing the same thing. I'm going to rotate my canvas, going to sample, and I'm just going to sample on these gradient colors here and then kind of just like repaint it in. And remember what I told you about the banding? It's visible at the moment because, as I mentioned, your zooming distance is a little bit far away, so it doesn't know how to render that okay. but zoomed in, you'll be fine. So let me double check that the notes were okay. It says smooth out gradient between dark and light. And so basically we're just going to sample here and do a nice smooth gradient. Maybe too much. Let's see. Like so. I think that looks really good, and I'm just using my artistic integrity to paint a little bit of what I think it should look like. Maybe like so, maybe not. And if I don't like it, I can easily use the eraser brush, again with just a really gentle flow, and smooth it out just a little bit so we see the kind of like the original shape coming through. And I think that looks really good. I'll do the same thing where I actually go ahead and add some noise. And then I can hit Command E, and what Command E will do is it'll take these two layers, it'll take this top layer and merge it into the bottom one, like so. And now we have all of the background cleaning in one layer. And the reason I did that is because now I can add a mask to that layer, and I can brush away any areas that were accidentally brushed on the model. And this is very important because you do not want that background color being painted on the dress or the model, because Lara will probably kill me. we definitely don't want that. That looks great. Now I could do the same thing with just carrying on, really, using the healing brush and maybe tackling that, or the clone brush. I can even use the paintbrush at 2% flow and just feather out some of these transitions if I want to. If I want to be extra nice and really impress her, I could probably do that. I think she'd really appreciate it, going the extra mile, right? Same thing goes for the dress here. I'll go back to my clone brush. And again, this is all just manually, making decisions on what you want to do, what you don't want to do. But I think focusing on creases is a good idea. Like so. That looks really nice. I think that looks much better. Another thing that we can focus on, and there's this like wrinkle here that's really bothering me, so let's focus on that. I'm going to add another layer as a safety precaution. I'm going to sample on the top, and then I'm going to brush lower like so. And the reason for that is now I can just mask it in that area. So I'm going to hit mask. I'm going to take my brush, select black, use a 10% flow, and I'm going to just mask out the areas that I really don't want applied. So around the belt, on the back, turn that on and off. Okay, like so. So that looks pretty good to me. We can dodge and burn later to really finesse that, but so far so good. We did the hair, we even did this area here actually. So I'll get rid of that. And we did this whole background. Goodbye. Okay, great. Let's see, I'm going to select that, delete, select that, delete, select that, and delete. So now we have a few things left to do, and that's going to be over here. We're going to go back down to our healing layer. Let's see what else we have. Let's see, sharpen eyes, reduce redness, and tone down redness. Okay, great. So most of the healing and cloning work that we needed to do for the skin is primarily done. If we want to just double check, we'll just go around here and do a couple of more healing steps. So you can see I don't do a ton of healing work. Most of the healing work that I focus on is going to be just the minor blemishes, really. Right? Great, that looks really good. Looks really good. And I'll get rid of that as well. Okay. I'm zooming in way too much, but I should do that. Okay, let's go ahead and hit Command S. We do not want to lose that. Next, what we'll do is we'll close this cleaning folder here. Let's recap. See, the cleaning folders turn on and off. So we did the dress, we did the face, the hair, the background. That looks much cleaner, right? Okay, great. It also matches this side now, looks really clean. Now going forward, if I want to keep it in 16-bit, that's fine. If you want to go back down to 8, that's fine as well. The only reason why going back down to 8 is acceptable is because now that we've done all of our work in 16-bit, when we go back down to 8, all the, I guess, the transitions and stuff will still be preserved. But I'm just going to keep it a 16-bit for now. But again, it doesn't really matter if you go back down to 8. The only difference is going to be that in 16-bit, your file size will be double. In 8-bit, it will be half of what it is currently. So approximately, give or take a few things. But just wanted to point that out in case you start saving every single file in 16-bit and you're wondering why your file sizes are so huge. Next step is we're going to be evening out skin a little bit more in terms of dodging and burning, because there's some patchiness happening across the face and the body, and I want to show you some techniques how to do that. So again, I'm going to add another folder. I'll call this my dodge and burn folder. And normally, as I mentioned, I have my actions. And so we will go ahead and add one curve layer here. And the first curve layer I'm going to bring up from the middle. And this is going to be our dodge layer. So I have my curve there. I'm going to invert this, Command I. I'm going to call this my dodge. Let's bring this out here for a second. My dodge. And then I'll do that again. But this time I'll bring one going downwards. I'll call this my burn. I'll select my mask, hit Command I to invert. The next step we will do is we're going to add a, let's say a solid color adjustment layer. I'm going to select black. Then we're going to bring this down to the color blend mode. And this is going to be our black and white view of the image. And the reason for this is now I can see tonality. I can see tonal transitions a lot easier. I can see that this area is a little bit more blotchy than say the arms. And now I can focus on dodging and burning. The principle is very simple. I'm going to click on my mask. And this mask controls any area that I want to brighten. So I'm going to use a 2% flow or 1% flow. As you can see that I've changed the value here. And then with my brush tool, I want to make sure that my value is set to white. Then I basically just want to go in here and focus on some of these areas. The main concern that I have with this particular image is, number one, the chest. So I'm going to be brightening up the chest a little bit. Like so. And I'm changing my brush size by either using the bracket keys on my keyboard, or if you change them to another shortcut, you can use any keys that you want. I personally like to use Q and W on my keyboard because it's a lot closer to my left hand and a right handed, so it makes it a lot easier for me to change the brush size. The brush size is also really important to change because you constantly want to change it based on the area that you're brushing in. So as you see that I'm working, every area that I'm working on has a different patch. So now that we have some areas brightened, you can see that as I turn the layer on and off, it actually impacts those areas more precisely. If I have a brush that's too big like this, and let's say I increase my flow to give you a better visual example, you see that everything becomes brighter where I brush. And that's not the goal I'm trying to get to. The goal I'm trying to get to is selectively brightening particular areas, and it's very important to distinguish. And if it's too slow for you, use a 2% flow or greater. Let's go back to the top of the arms where there was a lot more redness, and I guess, we want to tone that down. The best way to do it first is use a dodge and burn, because what happens is sometimes skin that's a little bit too dark or red or discolored or whatever has a darker tone to it as well. So dodging and burning first is very, very important because you're able to lighten up the appearance of these areas before shifting the color, because even if you shifted the color from red to say like neutral tone, you still will get like a dark neutral tone. It just won't look right. So this step is really, really important. You can see here where, you know, we've lightened that up really nicely, and now it blends in with the rest of the skin. I'll continue doing that anywhere else that I best see fit. But normally what we do is we just continue working like this till everything is kind of perfected. I'll also go ahead and use my burn tool because there's some areas here that I kind of want to darken. And I'll dodge a couple of spots as well. I'm also going to rotate my canvas because rotating for me is the best way of seeing things that I just normally wouldn't see by looking at the image straight on. You know what happens is sometimes you look at the image for so long that you get really bored of it, or not bored of it, but sometimes you just, you know, lose track of what you are looking at. And so rotating it gives you a fresh perspective in terms of what you should be seeing and what you're missing out on. And now we'll go to the face. I think I'm going to be darkening this bright area here where the cheek meets the edge of the mouth. I like the way that looks a lot. So I'll continue going around the face and just kind of bridging different gaps by going between the layers themselves. And now I'm going to be burning the transitions in the forehead and the scalp area too, because you want a nice kind of rounded shape as you go from the scalp to the middle of the face. Right, so you can see that I've kind of filled in those gaps with burning. This is the best way to learn, is when you look at people work, you end up seeing what you should be focusing on and what you shouldn't, or what you should. Another really great tip is you can burn some of the gaps in the eyebrows should you want to thicken them up or create a sense of evenness. Also works as like eyebrow filler. And again, I'm going to be using my burn tool, or the burn adjustment layer, to go ahead and burn down any of these different areas here. Now with my dodge, I'm also going to be dodging the dress, where we talked about earlier that there were these pieces that I wanted to brighten up. So I'll do so here. I think that looks really nice. I don't really want to overdo it as well, so I think I'm going to stick to that for the most part. And then of course, if you wanted to, if there's anything else you would take care of, then this would be the time to kind of go through and lightly brush away any blemishes or just blotchiness. Let's revisit and double check that the chest area is cleaned up. Okay, great. And also what I like to do is, how can I put this? At the top of my layer here, I'm going to add some noise. And we always try to add some noise because it just, or grain I should say, because it breaks up the image really nicely. It adds this like nice look to it. I know sometimes we like to do that as well. So I'm going to be adding a little bit as well. I'm going to hit Shift Delete on a blank layer where it comes up, it says content 50% gray. Then I'm going to go say filter noise, add noise. I'll say about 10% uniform monochromatic. And I'll set this to soft light. And just like that, it adds this nice gritty texture to it. I think it looks really beautiful, especially when you look at an image like this. I think it just adds an emphasis to it. So This is something that I'm going to keep on as I'm also working. And we can also reduce that if we want to by changing the opacity. I'll keep it to like 60% for now. All right, so I'm going to continue dodging a little bit more. And the rest of this seems to be just like freckles, so I'm not too concerned. Let's see here. She did mention the hotspot. Another way to get rid of a hotspot or finesse that in is a quick little tip that I want to show you. And we'll do that here in the cleaning stage. I'm going to go back down to my clone layer here. Let's hide this black and white for now. What I can do is I can sample, say, this side, use a 3% flow, and just brush from one side to the other. And what that does is it minimizes that hotspot by sampling the texture next to it. So that's a really great tip for those of you who want to do that. I can get rid of this curve here. I don't need that. Let's go back to our dodge and burn. Okay, that looks really good for me. I like that a lot. So the next step we are going to do is we are going to be, let me take the grain layer out of the dodge and burn. I'm going to put that on top of everything. And in case you don't know how to do that, what I basically did was I dragged it and I waited till there's like thin blue line that you can see here. If it's hovering over the folder like this, it's going to make a box around the folder. You do not want that. You want to make sure that there's a line above the folder and then you let go. And then it actually adds it on top of that folder. I'll call this grain for now as well. What we want to do now is there was a couple of notes that say tone down the redness and reduce redness. So I'll go ahead and go to another folder. I'll call this the color fix. And the way this works is actually quite simple. I'll select a blank layer. I'll change this to the color blend mode. Now that I have a color blend mode there, I can call this whatever I want, like redness. Now all I need to do is sample a skin tone that I like this. And as I start brushing, it's going to replace the original skin tone with whatever tone that I end up selecting. So if I select this neutral color and start brushing, it'll do the same thing for, say, like the back. And it'll do the same thing for like the chest if I wanted to. And see that area is a little bit gray, so it just filled it in with more saturation. And it matches the saturation and color of whatever you're selecting. So you can see here it went from like red to neutral, and the chest also matched a little bit better. Okay, and so that's kind of what it does, and it makes it a really nice even look. And you can do that for pretty much anything in case there's areas that are too red, like the fingertips, maybe they're too red. So I can come down here, sample another tone, and just brush around the fingertips. In case that doesn't work, just go ahead and sample another color and match that. So there you go. Let's take a look at our quick before and after. You can see here what we've done is kept everything quite minimal and gone around and healed and cloned till we got rid of all the areas of concern that Laura was mentioning. And the last two things we have to do is going to be our sharpen the eyes and pull in the dress. So let's go and do that. I'm going to hide the grain layer for now, because what I'm going to do next is I'm going to have a solid copy of everything that we worked on top. Because let's say we want to liquefy something now. How do we do that? We could go to our background, but if we try liquefying something in the background, what's going to happen is if we liquefy somewhere where we've already done work, it's going to make the layers not aligned, and it's going to displace everything that we've done on top of it. So we want to make sure that everything that we do liquefying wise does not interfere with anything else that we've done already. And the way we do that is we create a merge visible stamp. And that is basically a fancy way of saying copy everything that we've done, flatten it and put it on top of the entire layer stack. And the shortcut is going to be Shift, Option, Command, and the letter E. So pretty much every modifier you have on your keyboard, which is Shift, Option, Command, and E. If you're using a PC, it's Shift, Alt, Control, and E. The letter E as an elephant. And here we will call this our liquify. And then we will go to Filter, Liquify. And because Laura was mentioning bringing the dress a little bit, we will do so. I think it's just to give it a little bit more shape. We want to make sure the pressure over here is set to 5 and the density is set to 50. 5 is like flow, 50 is like softness. If I can quickly explain that really quickly. Okay. I'll push this in here so we have a nice even transition, I assume, that she's looking for. Like so. Okay, simple as that. And yep, that's exactly what she's looking for. Next is going to be sharpness. Now that we have a solid layer already there, and I want to add some sharpness, I'm going to go to Filter. Actually, I'm going to hit Command J to duplicate that layer. I'm going to call this Sharpness. And then I'm going to go to Filter, Sharpen, and Unsharp Mask. Here the goal is I'm going to click on the eye so I can see the eye itself. I want a radius of 0.5 pixels, and I'm going to change the amount. So you can see here the amount will vary. I can also increase the radius too, but if the higher radius you go, the higher of a contrast area it selects. So I think personally 0.5 is nice because it selects the fine details and amplifies those more readily than trying to put a radius of something much higher. So I'll select like this, sounds good. I use the 0.9 radius in the end. Then I want to mask just the eyes. So how do I do that? I hit Option, click on the mask, or Alt if you're on a PC. And then now I can brush in just the eyes. I'll increase the flow and brush in just the eyes. Okay, so you can see that the eyes themselves have improved their sharpness. The same thing goes with the lips if you want to do so, or with the face, or if there's anything else you want to do, which in fact I think I'm going to do because he has nice freckles and we did really good work, so I want to amplify that. Doesn't that look great? So we've tackled everything here. Now there's one little bonus that I also want to show you, and we're going to be doing some color grading as well. Now here's a color grade that I want to show you that Laura sent over to me. And what I basically did was asked her what kind of color grade she wanted. And so she did a quick little example, a generic example of how she wanted it to look. And so what I want to do now is I'm going to try to emulate that and try to get it as close as possible. And I know it's really difficult sometimes to see how to get there. And this is a good example of showing you how to do that. So I'm going to exit this out because we don't need this one anymore. I want to put these images side by side. I'll click on Window, Arrange, and Tile. And what Tile is going to do is it's going to put the images side by side, and that way I can kind of get a reference of what I'm doing as I'm working. I'll add another layer on top. I'll call this color grading. Typically with color grading, if I don't have any references, I'll use a tool like my infinite color panel that allows me to go through different color grades really quickly and get an idea of what's happening. But in this instance with Laura, she sent over a reference, and I think I want to, manually try and do that. So it'll give you an idea of how to manually color grade as well. I think it's really powerful to understand these concepts using a few adjustment layers. First thing first, I think what I notice is that the contrast in this image is a little bit more intense than this image. So I'll click on Levels, and I think I want to bring in my shadows a little bit here, so it matches the end of the histogram. And then on this side, I'm going to bring this in as well, so the highlights are a little bit punchier. So it compresses the information of the image. So it makes, whatever shadows that were missing, it just compresses them on this side because it wasn't as deep. Obviously, this is still not as deep as this one. This is a lot deeper already, but I think what I'm going to do is maybe back off just a little bit here. So I think that's more accurate. And now with the highlights, you can see here that there was a gap. So I just brought the point into where the highlights began. And what that does is it makes the brightest image almost completely bright, or 255. And it just adds a lot of contrast. So that's another way of adding contrast. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to bring the overall vibrance of this image down, because over here I noticed that the image generally is not very saturated. And saturation often plays a role in how the colors play on the image. A more saturated image has less room for additional colors. A less saturated image has more room for additional colors to play around in. So you can see here that there's more of a blue and green kind of cast, and the original skin tones are not very saturated. And what that does is the blues tend to play more forward. They stand in front of the image a lot more than this one, because right now the skin is very red, everything's more saturated and vibrant. So I want to tone down the vibrancy a lot. So I'm going to go down to vibrance. And here I like to play around with different settings, but I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and put the vibrance down. The difference between vibrance and saturation is vibrance is going to target the areas that are most saturated first. So if I bring down the vibrance, it brings down the areas that are most saturated first while keeping everything else the same level of saturation, if you want to think of it that way. The opposite happens as I increase my vibrance. As I increase my vibrance, it focuses on the areas that are not very saturated and brings them up first. But in this case, we're bringing it down. So I want to bring it down to like minus, or I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm going to bring it down like this. I think that looks very close, wouldn't you say? You can see the vibrance has toned down. If I click on this eye over here on my adjustments layer, you can see the skin has toned down the vibrance. Now you can see the saturation level on the skin matches. And here you can see the contrast matches. So we've separated this toning into two different categories. Number one, contrast. Number two, saturation and vibrance level. The next thing we want to do is actually color toning or color grading. But you can see color grading has an impact in how contrast and saturation works. And now we're going to add the colors on top of it. First thing we're going to go to is going to be our blue channel here. And I think what we want to do is play around with it. So if you think of it, blue going upwards adds blue, going downwards takes away blue, so it kind of like adds yellow. But what we want to do is go towards a bluer cast, correct? So I think we should bring this up a little bit here and maybe use the arrow keys to push it up like so. I think that looks pretty good. And it's a little bit too blue, and I want to add more of that like teal in it. So we'll go down to our green channel, because that's where I think is going to be the next thing, and we're going to add a little bit of green as well. Like so. So you can see it's adding a little bit of teal color, but that's not quite there yet. So let's now go to our red channel. And so going down adds like a cyan, going up adds more red. So I think we're going to add a little bit of cyan in there to really top it off. So it's like a mix of blue, cyan, and green. And personally, that's something that I always like to do, is like play around and see how similar it starts looking. And you always get an idea based on what happens when you play around with the image. Next thing that I want to do is, aside from that, I'm going to go into my color balance. Now the color balance is great because now you can add different colors in different areas. So the highlights, for example, if I feel like there should be more yellows in the highlights, I could do that. If there's more blue in the highlights, I can do that. So I can say like -4 in the highlights and maybe less magenta as well. And so I'm kind of just like playing around till I get somewhere that's kind of similar. Obviously it won't be identical, but it'll be close enough. Finally, what I think I could do is I can go to my hue saturation. I can select my red channel, which is going to be the reds in the image, and I can push and pull them to get closer to where I want to. Now I can go and tweak each individual parameter like levels. I can say maybe that was too punchy. I can bring back because I'm looking at the hair here, and the hair is not as dark, so now it looks a lot closer. I can still see this like red patch, and that was from the pre-retouch area, but the skin itself looks a little bit cleaner. Let's say I want to add like this nice punch to the image, like this mid-tone contrast, this contrast at the pore level, if so to speak. I can obviously sharpen, but what I could also do is something in between. I can sample, or I can go to my adjustment layers and say black and white. Now under black and white, I can change it to a soft light adjustment layer. I can bring that down to like 12, something like that. And what that does is it adds just a nice kind of like punch to it. And the reason for that is what it's doing is if I bring this back to normal again for a second and bring up the opacity to 100, you can see that it creates a black and white view of the image. And the way dodging and burning works is anything that's black will darken an image, anything that's white will brighten an image. So it's basically adding this like dodge and burn map on top of the image. It's adding a black and white view of the original image on top of everything that we've done. And the reason for that is when we change the blend mode to soft light, anything that's white is going to brighten, anything that's dark is going to darken. So the arms over here will get brighter, the arms over here will get darker because this is darker and that's brighter. So let's take a look. I'm going to put this soft light. So you can see here it gets darker and it gets brighter. So it's adding this like contrast, but it's carving out the image in a way that's very natural. Because if you did that by hand, it wouldn't look as nice. And so it's obviously going to look a little bit different. And then from there, anything else we want to do, we can change it up and adjust it, so to speak. But I try to get it as close as possible. And if it's not, then I send it to Lara and she'll adjust it to match kind of like her preference. But that's kind of, you know, what my starting point is. And then we can also add a curve if you want to increase exposure. We can then go and say we want more highlights. If we want more highlights, if we want to change the shadows, we can do that. We can increase and add a little bit of like fade to the image, which I think looks pretty nice. That little fade, as I turn this on and off here, you can see what I mean. The shadows get a little bit faded. The highlights add a little punchiness to it. It's kind of a fun thing to play around with. So there you go. Here's our color grading, our before and after of our color grading, just based on these little principles that we worked on. So take a look at what we've done already. And we first start with our levels. We took away the vibrance. We added an overall cast to get close enough. We went into our color balance to tweak some of these individual areas like our highlights. We added some warmth in there. We went into our hue and saturation and changed the reds to a little bit of yellows. You can see the skin go from reds to yellows just a touch. We added a black and white for a little bit of punch. And then we added curves for more individual punch to different regions like our highlights and shadows or things like that. So creative control. Then finally with our grain, we see our quick before and after. And hopefully, let's take a look at our full screen here, hitting F on our keyboard. And you can see here, again, the banding is not there. It is just when we are zoomed out. Okay, so there we have it. This is our particular image. And hopefully, let's take a look at our before and after. I think I'm happy with that. And then from this point forward, I'll send this image to Lara, get a quick overview in what she wants to fix and not fix, and then do any revisions necessary. And finally, Lara also sent over a black and white color scheme that I think I want to bring into the image so you can see a reference of that as well. So what I would do in that situation is I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go to Window, Arrange, and Tile. And here, now that I have my color grading done, I'll add a black and white conversion folder 2. I'll select my black and white adjustment layer. And then from here, I'll just slowly tweak and make sure that the resemblance is a little bit closer. So I'll deepen the reds a little bit and then also play with the yellows and blacks. I think the yellow going somewhere there looks good. And then from there, I'll either play with like a curves to tweak it a little bit in case it's not perfect, and add these 3 little points here in the midtones, highlights, and shadows so I can get the exact kind of contrasts or control in each of these regions that I think would look best. So something like that looks pretty good for me. And you can see here that I have a black and white option as well next to the image. And again, it's not perfect, but the main thing is getting as close as possible for her to have options to play with in case she wants to do that. And again, either one is acceptable in case we want to go black and white or color. I'll leave this to her, but ultimately this seems to be the workflow that we normally go to. We retouch the image, send it over, and then she tweaks anything that needs to be tweaked, or I do any revisions that are necessary. And typically the retouching process is that straightforward, and hopefully you learned a lot. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to send me a message and let us know. We are always happy to help. And in case you want to learn more about retouching, also check out the retouching series that covers a lot of this in in-depth detail.